Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif. Arif, what the hell are the Chiefs doing?
No, they're doing everything possible to not extend D Ford. He's coming off a 13-sack season. Okay, so I don't know if you heard. But
this is why we don't record shows in the afternoon.
Right, yeah. So the Seahawks and the Chiefs have agreed to a trade where they trade so the Chiefs trade for Frank Clark, and they give up a first-rounder and a 2020 second-rounder, which is just incredible because Frank Clark is like better than D Ford. That's like true, fine. He's not like that. You have to extend both of them. They're both essentially on franchise deals, or I mean, Frank Clark technically hasn't signed his, but you have to extend Frank Clark. So you're choosing to extend one guy, and while it's true that you're choosing to extend the better guy, he's going to be more expensive when you extend him, and you're giving up a first and a second to do it. It's nuts to me. Someone's like, oh, D Ford's, bad at defending the run, which, like, who cares? And then someone else is like, D Ford might have back problems, but I don't know. I mean, Frank Clark has like hitting women problems, which I feel like has been a issue for the Chiefs. So it's not like you're getting like a clean prospect or anything. It's wild. I don't know, man.
Seattle just took them to the cleaners and got way more than they could have possibly like dreamed of. What I like about this scenario is that in the days prior to this, it had been reported that the Jets were also involved in potential trade deals for him, and the Jets didn't end up getting him again. So like this is like the 80th time this offseason that the Jets have tried to get somebody and not.
Yeah.
Darn shame. Maybe he was about to sign with the Jets and decided he had like
just felt sick.
Felt sick. Couldn't imagine himself not being with Andy Reid, I guess. Welcome to the episode. We've got.
You know what this means? Seattle finally has their Percy Harvin trade.
It's about time. Good. Welcome to Norse Code. We've got plenty of stuff to talk about. This is the last stop before the draft. We have a bunch of things to talk about, including the Adam Thielen extension, which was big news that dropped immediately after we put out the last episode. So that was fun timing for those of us in the podcast game. We also have a couple things to talk about as far as the schedule is concerned, because the schedule has been released, and there's a couple of interesting tidbits on there, including a Monday night game in Seattle, which right after the bye. Yeah. Kind of an interesting timing on that, and a couple of cool things for the mailbag. So before we do begin, just want to thank you guys so much for listening and helping out over the last 5.5 years now. Really do appreciate it. We do have a donation to speak of this episode, so just want to give a quick shout out to Lucas Reisinger. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do appreciate the tree fitty to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay and help keep the lights on around here. If you would like to help keep the lights on around here, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode, or you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode and give a quick donation there. This also goes to things like overhead. It also helps with things like web hosting and potential trips to away games, which we'll be discussing later in the episode. So again, thank you guys so much for helping. Even if you do not do something in the way of a donation, you can also just share a link on Twitter, on Facebook, on social media, and just mention to a friend, hey, Norse Code is a pretty decent podcast. The analyst is pretty good anyway, so it's totally worth listening to. So with all of that said, welcome to the episode. And the first thing that we should talk about is that Adam Thielen got paid, and it's pretty much the same kind of money that the Diggs ended up getting.
Which I mean, I think that should be expected, right? Because Diggs and Thielen are very similar receivers that have similar production profiles, and of course, I've made it clear on the show before that I think Diggs is the better of the two receivers, but timing is everything. Thielen ends up with a higher dollar per year value, but that's only because Diggs signs his deal in the 2018 cap environment. Thielen signs his deal in the 2019 cap environment, but the new money average kind of kicks in. It's a weird structure, kind of kicks in 2020. So it might even actually look even cheaper than it is. You have to remember that, the way that you view these deals should always be in the context of the same amount of resources that every NFL team has. That same amount tends to grow every year. So yeah, they're essentially very similar deals, just kind of outside the top 10, I think 12 and 13, in terms of percentage of cap space taken up at time of signing. So yeah, extremely similar deals, and I think identical amounts of guaranteed money, although they come in like slightly different structures. So I think it's a pretty good deal. You end up with two receivers that are being paid 12th and 13th in the league in terms of money taken up, and they're both probably top 10 receivers. So, slightly, underpaying or overutilizing, however you want to, view it, depending on your viewpoint, both, which is great.
So the final numbers on this included a 4-year extension for $64 million with a possible cap of, I believe, 73 million or something like that, with extra incentive bonuses on it. So this was quite the deal. And considering the cap environment that the Vikings have found themselves in, with the addition of Kirk Cousins and a myriad of other extensions, this is again another example of cap wizardry.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of interesting because the expectation was that the deal would decrease the cap liability in the first year. It increased it by $5,000. So obviously, not meaningful. It fits completely inside the Vikings cap limitations. It still means that the Vikings probably have to do something by the time they sign their draft picks, which, that cap liability or accounting may not even occur until, those signings occur, right? Which could happen late in the process, or right before training camp. So they have to make some move. I think there's a sense of urgency that'll happen around the draft. That's when players are traded, of course, unless you're the Seahawks, and then the players get traded a couple of days before the draft. But there's maybe that sense of urgency that would be the best time to do it. Plus, all of the assets are on the table. Whereas after the draft, you obviously don't get to trade for 2019 draft picks. So that still has to happen in order to sign everybody from the draft. But for the most part, I think that this is another example, like you said, of cap wizardry, where you have the ability to sign a player, get them, all the money that they want up front, still maintain your cap. Maybe you sacrifice some flexibility, but still maintain the cap room that you need. So, really excellent work.
So here's the I know Vikings fans aren't used to this form of negativity, so I do have to just start with that. When do these sorts of deals and this sort of wizardry come to bite us in the ass? Is there a point where this ends up becoming too much?
Kind of. The idea behind sacrificing flexibility and backloading contracts is that you end up in a scenario where you have a bunch, this happened to the Raiders a couple of years ago before Reggie McKenzie cleaned house, where you just end up having too many big contracts and you can't sign any useful players because all the players that are past their prime are bloated on contracts, or maybe not even past their prime. They're just players that, you sign to a big money deal to get them in the door, and they're above average players and you paid them elite money, and now they cost too much. That's certainly a possibility that when you kick the can down the road, you'll end up hitting a cap squeeze. And that cap squeeze might occur as early as next year. The Vikings only have $8 million in projected cap space in 2020. That's going to be a problem because that means they can't re-sign anybody, and they've got a couple of free agents hitting the market, among them Trey Waynes, Kyle Rudolph, Mackenzie Alexander. And if you hope to retain any of them, you have to release some cap room somewhere. But the bigger cap squeeze might be in 2021. Where obviously they have more projected cap space available, but they still want to make sure that they can bring in free agents and re-sign their guys that have been performing well. So in theory, yes, but I think that the way that the Vikings tend to meticulously plan these cap details out to the exact date and year, it's probably not going to be too much of a problem. Plus, I mean, the amount of guaranteed money that goes past the second year of a lot of these deals is very low. In fact, I think Thielen was probably wrong to take that relatively low amount of guaranteed money because after 2020, the team can basically do whatever they want with very minimal cap liability.
So how does a deal like this end up getting built? Is this something that turns into more of a like signing bonus thing? Because there are ways around major cap issues, and you've seen other teams kind of like their strategy turns into, well, we're going to front load this on signing bonuses, or we're going to end up like backloading it on certain other stuff. So how does this end up? How does this end up working?
Yeah, well. Again, if they plan it poorly, it ends up in a scenario where you end up with like $60 million in dead cap space, and you're essentially paying out cap liability to players that aren't on the roster. That's the worst case scenario. But I just don't think that that's likely given the Vikings' track record in this situation. I think that what's going to happen is that we're going to see some players traded that, ideally wouldn't be traded. Someone like, we keep on bringing up Trey Waynes. It could potentially be Xavier Rhodes. You'll see some players that are, maybe good to have, but are kind of luxuries. And maybe that's Kyle Rudolph, who is, an above average tight end being paid above average money, but an extension would just be a little bit too much. And players that maybe you're attached to because they've spent a lot of time with the team or are important in the community, maybe they have to leave. But I think for the most part, they're focusing resources in areas that tend to win games. So, receivers, cornerbacks, quarterbacks. It'll create some crunches, but I mean, the Vikings have a lot of the defensive side of that kind of figured out already. And it's really about making sure that they can get a couple of cheap contracts coming in that will produce. And that could be, this year's draft, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, it's not a make or break draft. They could continue to develop the players from last year's draft as well as, and that includes Mike Hughes, which can kind of alleviate the concerns about maybe trading Trey Waynes or Xavier Rhodes, but also, next year's draft, if they find an instant starter, that can also help them kind of relieve future cap room.
Also, if we're going to be talking about Vikings extensions, we can talk about Anthony Harris and Rashad Hill, who both signed their tenders.
Expected, but nice. They didn't really have other options because they're restricted free agents, but it's good. Obviously, I think Rashad Hill is miscast as a starter. He didn't play very well as a starter, but he's a kind of an above-average backup tackle, which those are pretty hard to find. And then Anthony Harris is a starting quality safety who ended up having a pretty stellar year. So good to see, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Anthony Harris get a long-term extension, even during the year, much less, which, I mean, the Vikings don't tend to do that a lot. But, maybe even before training camp or during the year or possibly, immediately at the conclusion of the year, one of those things. I wouldn't be surprised if we got a long-term extension.
Yeah. Well, the next thing that I'd like to talk about on this episode of Norse Code is kind of diverting to the athletic stuff. And we can talk about the Consensus Big Board, which is now live.
Yeah, so for people who are unfamiliar, it's one of the big things I do every year is that I gather, big boards from this year it'll end up being 50. Right now it's a little bit above 45. Big boards from a bunch of different draft analysts. That includes all the folks at the Draft Network, Benjamin Solak, Kyle Krabs, obviously Dan Brugler of The Athletic, Mel Kiper, ESPN, Todd McShay, Chris Presto, CBS, and then also a bunch of blogs that have tended to perform well in terms of predicting player performance. And so, the Huddle Report tends to score a lot of those guys with their system. But the Huddle Report has their own board. I'm including that. NFL Rough Draft, I'm including that. And a bunch of analysts that I know. Ben Natan, my partner for the somewhat defunct Wide Left podcast.
It hasn't posted a new episode in 2 years, but it's alive, and it's alive in the hearts and the
new people keep following the Twitter account every day. We'll see.
It's alive in the hearts, minds, and podcast Apple Podcast app subscriptions for those who loved it.
Yeah, exactly.
There we go.
Damn
horse puncher.
So I've got 45, 50 big boards coming in, and the process that I do to craft this consensus big board is a little bit different than other consensus big boards. They tend to just average out the ranks, and then there you go. And I don't really like that approach because it treats the differences between the first and the third pick the same as the differences between the 101st and 103rd pick. And that's obviously not how evaluators look at it or NFL teams look at it. So what I do is I've got essentially a model of the Jimmy Johnson trade chart and the Chase Stewart football perspective trade chart, and I assign point values based off of that model formula. And so if you're, ranked number one, that in one board, that board is given that player 3,000 points. If you're ranked number two, that board is given that player, 2,600 points. And then those are the scores that I tend to average out with some, modifications made to reduce outliers and stuff like that. At the end of the day, what it means is that, a player ranked first has the appropriate weight assigned to them, versus not having any variance between these picks, because that's how talent is distributed in the NFL, how talent is distributed in the draft, and how NFL teams and how NFL evaluators see that talent. And that gives us opportunities to do stuff like compare different types of boards against each other, which is up at The Athletic. There's two types of board, forecasters and evaluators, and I'll get to that in a second. But it also allows you to, I think, more accurately assess kind of the variance between players. If there's like a high variance player at a premium spot, this year's best example might be Rashawn Gary. This kind of approach allows you to take a better look at that kind of variance. And also, it allows you to kind of track. I've been doing this since 2014, kind of track performance of various boards. And what's really nice is that the forecaster board is very, very good at predicting the NFL draft. And that means that the two groups of boards that I look at, one group is a group that's composed primarily of people who have a lot of access, people who have sources on teams, people like, Mel Kiper and Dane Brugler, who have information about, kind of what team priorities are and how the NFL views, the evolution of the league and what kind of players kind of fit that. They also have a better understanding of kind of the background character of a player, because NFL teams kind of have their own private investigators doing that sort of stuff. And they also have a better understanding of the injuries that may be, impacting other players and stuff. And they can use that information to impact their assessment of draft prospects, so long as they're careful about, NFL teams, potentially misleading them or setting up smoke screens. So that ends up, the mean board that's set up for those forecasters ends up doing a pretty good job predicting the draft, but it also allows us to get an understanding of who those players might be that might have hidden character or medical concerns, or that might have, traits that the NFL just tends to love that, it's not very easy to see on film, because you can compare it against the evaluator board, which are guys that rely a little bit more on just kind of what they see on tape. And, some of them, don't necessarily have to just rely on tape. I know the Draft Network guys travel around the country and get credentialed to watch these games for scouting purposes. And then they also, go to events like the Senior Bowl and stuff like that. But it's really a raw evaluation from their end. Whereas, and that's kind of just how all these evaluators work, whereas the other ones tend to be able to use sources and kind of leverage that. And that gives us the ability to compare those boards and come to conclusions there. But yeah, no, it's a fun, project. I get kind of an understanding, a better picture of what the draft looks like with that consensus. There's a lot of research that says, wisdom of the crowds is very good at kind of doing stuff like prediction forecasting, especially when it comes to ranked order outcomes. So, I've got that up. It's got 300 players. There's going to be another update that pushes about Wednesday night that will update it with all of the big boards that have kind of rolled in. So, yeah, go over to theathletic.com, check it out. That's one of like the 4 articles I've published in the past 2 days.
been a bit busy.
Yeah, a little bit.
Just a tad. And again, that is over at theathletic.com. Finally, before we hit the mailbag, we can talk about the NFL schedule, which was released last week. Highly anticipated, as always, and the freakouts over potential leaks and non-leaks aside, the Vikings have 5 primetime games this year. So we're guaranteed 5 losses.
Basically. That's what it means.
It's pretty much. I mean, why else would something like that be happening? 5 primetime games for the. I guess I shouldn't be terribly surprised. I mean, the Browns have a surprising amount as well, but then you have to remember the Browns are actually becoming a halfway decent and or watchable team. But 5 primetime games? That still seems a bit much for. Does that mean that we can finally stop saying as a fan base that everyone's overlooking us and nobody's really paying attention to us? Nobody's talking about us.
I mean, I think, we'll spin whatever narrative works for us at that specific moment. If I know,
be like, no, yeah, nobody's talking about us. You guys are 5-0. Nobody's talking about us.
Yeah, right, exactly. You know what? No one's and I like that. I like that no one's talking about us because we do best as underdogs. You're number one in every power ranking, and no one's talking about it. Isn't that crazy that no one's talking? We always best as underdogs. You know what? Let them ignore us.
Vikings Twitter is the worst. So starting off with the Falcons in Minnesota, it was widely reported that this was going to be the first leak that ended up coming out was basically that the Falcons and the Vikings were going to be playing in Minnesota to start, which is also to say that the Falcons schedule release on Twitter, top notch. Top notch. If you're going to troll New Orleans, you troll New Orleans.
Right, like I think without the troll, it's like a top 3 out of all which I can't even believe I'm talking about it like this because it's a schedule release. But so many accounts did such a great job with this like
Panthers
kind
too.
of. The Panthers did a fantastic job.
But the Falcons were on another level for what they did with that Ram.
Right, yeah. So I kind of don't want to spoil it, but whatever. Just watch it. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's a schedule release. It's like boring, right? They killed it.
to be sure. So the way the first 8 weeks ends up working out is that Atlanta comes to Minnesota. We go to Green Bay. Raiders come to Minnesota. We go to Chicago. We go to New York for the Giants. Then the Eagles and Carson Wentz, presumably, maybe.
Yeah, well, assuming he's got the guts to play.
I mean. Sure. The Eagles will be coming to Minnesota. The Vikings will be going to Detroit, and then in a Thursday night game, the Redskins will be coming to Minnesota. The Redskin game seems to be the one that everyone is circling on their calendar.
I mean, yeah, you've got like a fun revenge narrative. But...
I like the idea that Kirk Cousins, as white bread as he could possibly be, has like a revenge game in him.
Yeah, that's like we're not talking about Brett Favre here, right? Like,
I mean, he's a competitive guy. Yes, I find it hard to believe that he's driving to the Vikings offices and the stadium that day in his big van, just going, I'm taking these guys out. I really wish they hadn't treated me the way they did. I'm gonna show them. As he's like tapping his like driver, like as he's tapping the steering wheel to like Chicago or some like yacht rock, like he's just rocking to Hall & Oates.
Perfect. Yeah.
Just something like that. Rest of the
Ben
schedule.
Just a dish best served funky as hell.
I feel like we have a new slogan for the year. The rest of the schedule is at Kansas City, at Dallas, then the Broncos will be coming to Minnesota, then the bye week, and then the Seahawks game Monday night. That'll be fun. December 8th, week 14, Lions come to Minnesota. We go to the Chargers, which looks interesting. And then the last 2 weeks are the Packers and the Bears coming to Minnesota. So once again, death, taxes, and the Bears to end the season.
Yeah. For the last 5 seasons, 7 of the last 10. Okay, sure. I mean, fine. Like, it's such a weird thing because, like, and obviously, like, this is not how the NFL schedule is built. It's not built around what would be best for one team or one division. But it is just like weird because you'd think that it would be, Vikings Packers or Bears Packers in Week 17. But it just like hasn't been that. It's been Packers Lions and Vikings Bears, which, I mean, sometimes you construct the schedule with an understanding of like kind of who the playoff competitors are and stuff like that. But while it might make sense to say, hey, the Vikings and the Bears are the most likely to be the most dramatic game to finish the season, I don't think that was true the other years where that happened from like a beginning of the season. Like obviously this Vikings Bears game last year ended up being like, meaningful-ish until it quickly wasn't. But, I think for the most part, people wouldn't have agreed that was that kind of the most dramatic likely finish. So, yeah, I don't really know what drives it, except to say that, you have to schedule 16 other or 15 other matchups that week. And sometimes you can't work it out. So you just kind of fall into familiar patterns. So, yeah, I don't know why it is, but it is. So there you go.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so we get to play the Chicago Bears again, which I cannot wait for the Chicago Bears to turn into the 2018 Jags. I'm really looking forward to that Cinderella thing just wearing off and the clock hitting 12. Maybe that's just me. Maybe he forgets how to throw. I was going to say turn left, but maybe he forgets how to throw left again, and then everybody gets happy. So
that would be pretty remarkable.
That if he could just forget how to turn left too, that'd be a dramatic change for an NFL quarterback.
Yeah.
Let's start with the mailbag. Luke Braun asks, who on the roster has the most to lose this weekend? Sort of like how Mackenzie Alexander's future got really murky after the Hughes pick.
Well, the obvious answer is like an interior offensive lineman, right? I mean, there's no set starter at left guard. It might be Danny Isadora, Dakota Dozier, or I don't know, Aviant Collins. I don't know, but obviously, like one of them, is very likely to have to risk kind of losing their job. If the Vikings draft a tackle, Riley Reif ends up playing guard for a year before getting cut, essentially. So he would have a significant amount to lose. But honestly, I think the more interesting answer is probably Trey Waynes, aside from, obviously literally getting traded, or someone like Jaleel Johnson, who is, fighting in a depth battle at defensive tackle with Shamar Stephen and possibly Jalen Holmes and Ifeadi Odenigbo, but depending on how the Vikings see those two players. And if the Vikings draft kind of a three technique defensive tackle, that kind of pushes everyone down. And Jaleel Johnson, who's been better as a three technique, but kind of has the body of a nose tackle, and has been kind of forced into that tweener role, he might just kind of get dropped out at the bottom, or Shamar Stephen might get dropped off the bottom of the roster. So I think that's kind of the more interesting answer, is that, one of those guys. As for starters, I don't think, aside from the Riley Reif thing I mentioned, I don't think any of the starters are kind of really slated to lose a lot, unless, of course, the Vikings draft a tight end, and that's it for Kyle Rudolph.
Yeah, that would end up being a slightly different situation. Viking of the North asks, though he wasn't a consistent threat, Aldrick Robinson made some excellent catches last season. Why is there no buzz around him or maybe even BB contesting for the wide receiver third position?
Well, Robinson hasn't signed, so or I don't even know if the Vikings offered him, but he's not on the team, actually. So it's really just about BB. And I think that there's just a talent ceiling with Robinson, and there's not, I think, enough there to say with BB to say that you'd be comfortable with him being the wide receiver 3. And so I think that your average third or fourth round pick could probably compete for that spot a little bit better than BB can. So, or rather can outcompete BB for that same spot. So, yeah, I mean, BB looks all right, in like his 12 snaps from scrimmage or whatever when he was promoted to the active roster. And that's already kind of outperforming his expectations as an undrafted free agent. It's pretty rare for a player to even get to that point. But, I wouldn't be comfortable with the idea that he's the primary competition at that position, just because he hasn't shown enough for, I think, you to be comfortable with that.
Next question is from Mr. Dan, who asks, if the Vikings draft Andre Dillard in the first, would it be smart to trade up in the second if a high-quality three-tech defensive tackle or guard, if they're still available?
It might, actually, yeah. The concern at three technique is that it dries up fairly quickly. It kind of depends on, how teams view Jerry Tillery, who could be kind of, one of the guys that would be available in the second, but I kind of don't feel like he lasts all the way to 50. It may also depend on Dramont Jones, the Ohio State tackle. That he doesn't quite fit what the Vikings look for at that position, but if they're kind of just out of defensive tackles, maybe they go after him. So that is, I think, maybe the best approach. After Ed Oliver and Quinn Williams are gone. The next likely to go is Christian Wilkins. Then you've got questions about Rashawn Gary if he goes. Then kind of who are you left with? And for some people, I know PFF is very high on Jerry Tillery. For some people, that's Tillery. But for a lot of people, they wouldn't put him that high. And I wouldn't put, the other defensive tackles like Vermont Jones or potentially LJ Collier, who might transition from edge to defensive tackle. I wouldn't put them in that spot. So I would say that there's a good chance that, hey, they draft Bradbury or Lindstrom or whatever guard at 18, or they trade down a little bit and draft a guard at 20 or something, that it would make sense for them based off of just the fact that defensive tackle, and especially 3-technique defensive tackle, drops off a cliff. It would make sense for them to trade up, because at least at nose tackle, you've got, Rennell Wren, and Kalen Saunders and potentially Dexter Lawrence could fall into the second round, but that's not as important for the Vikings as a 3-technique, like a Vermont Jones or a Jerry Tillery.
Next question is from Zen Cupid, who asks, how probable is it that both Waynes and Rudy are dealt during the draft?
I'd say it's not super likely. Both are on the last year of the contracts. Neither of them have gotten extended. Rudy has openly expressed, a desire to be extended, and the Vikings apparently haven't even approached him about that. So you could see it, but I think that the Vikings don't want to gut their team. They just want to make kind of a smart move that hurts the least, that still gives them kind of room and flexibility going forward. Because I think the Vikings are still in kind of a win now. I shouldn't say mentality, but kind of that's the mode that they've shifted to. And you can still trade a starter and be in that mode so long as your understanding is that you've got a starter kind of ready and willing to go, or that's what you're trading for. And if the Vikings say trade a second-round pick for Trey Waynes, they could probably draft a cornerback in the second round that's got a good chance of starting early. Whereas with Kyle Rudolph, that one's tough unless you draft someone like T.J. Hawkinson. And if you do that, you probably trade him on the second day. Because it'd be difficult to trade him on the first day for second-round picks or third-round picks or fourth-round picks or whatever he's worth. And so you draft Hawkinson or Noah Fant or maybe even Irv Smith Jr. from Alabama in the first round, and then spend all night trying to trade Rudolph. And that would be weird, because I think by the end of it, you convince yourself that you'd prefer a 2-tight-end set. So I think it's most likely that that you'll end up with just one of those two being traded. And I think given the depth that you have, it's going to be Trey Waynes. And they don't want to be in a situation where they're sacrificing so much capital or so much in assets right now in order to generate capital for the future that they kind of cripple their ability to compete right away.
Next question is from Matt Beckendorf, who asks, with all the AAF signings on defense, do you think they'll be drafting more offensive players in the later rounds?
Yeah, I kind of like this question because it's like an interesting, different way to look at it. And yeah, maybe. I'm kind of hoping that there's some offensive players in the early rounds too, and that will make it for a surprisingly offensive draft. But, age concerns aside, because like Darren Smith is like 26 or whatever, you've essentially got undrafted free agents that have spent a little bit of time on a practice squad that you've just signed, a couple of them. And seventh rounders versus undrafted free agents, they tend to get a little bit more opportunity. But the difference between them in terms of talent for NFL teams is not that significant. They tend to actually even be on the same board in terms of tiers. So, I think that's a good way to think about it, especially because, like, hey, you're kind of worried about depth at safety. Well, the Vikings, they got a safety or two. Jordan Martin's the other one. The Vikings only really ever enter the offseason with 4 or 5 safeties on the 90-man. They might not draft a safety. So, I do think that their defensive investments in the AAF probably do impact the draft strategy a little bit, just because it allows you to kind of adjust your late round priorities.
Next question is from Ryan, who asks, how exactly will Rick piss off fans on night 1, and how will he try to redeem himself on night 2?
I think it's drafting a defensive player round 1 and then, finding the perfect offensive lineman to fall into that slot in round 2. Like, I mean, that's the most Rick thing ever. Like, he almost did it last year. And they still even got Brian O'Neill out of the process, so it wasn't all bad. But yeah, I mean, that happens a lot. Like, when they drafted Trey Waynes, I was so ticked off. I thought it was like just such a poor use of a first round pick. I thought he was a second round quality player. And then in the second round, they drafted Eric Kendricks, and I was like, oh, Eric Kendricks, he's a guy that I actually had mocked in the first, where the Vikings trade down in the first to, I don't know, was it pick 23 or something, so that the Panthers could grab Coney Ely. Oof, rough mock. I mean, they did, by the way, but like, shouldn't have. But they traded down and grabbed Eric Kendricks in the first round. And I thought of Eric Kendricks as a first-round player and Trey Waynes as a second-round player. And that's kind of exactly how the draft played out, kind of in terms of the inverse. And, I was angry because I was like, that's such a waste of capital. That's not very good. And someone was like, well, Arif, if you switched them, would you be happy? And I was like, well, yeah, I guess. And they were like, well, then duh. Like, just chill out. So fair enough. This seems to happen a lot where, at the end of the first round, you're kind of gnashing your teeth. But by the end of the second round, you kind of see maybe where they're going. That happened a little bit last year, too, with Mike Hughes and then Brian O'Neill, although, again, their need was not at tackle. Still, a lot of people were a lot more okay with that after the drafting Brian O'Neill.
All right, let's go to the I want to say the complicated question of this particular episode. Josh Swedlin asks, which draft day scenarios best represent the following GIF reactions on Twitter? Close-up man with beard, nod of approval. The "this is fine" burning dog, burning building with dog. Burning dog would be slightly different.
No.
Great Gatsby holding up the drink with fireworks going off in the background, and the "no God, please no" for Michael Scott.
I think that the beard is an offensive line pick, and in particular a well-regarded one. So someone like Garrett Bradbury or Chris Lindstrom, who again I see as a first-round quality player. That I think is probably the beard. The no is probably a defensive back. Because duh. That one just kind of writes itself. I think the Great Gatsby Leonardo DiCaprio one, that's probably like a good trade, right? Like the mailbag, someone asked me, would you trade Trey Waynes and the 18th overall pick for Oakland's, I think it was 24th and 27th picks? And, I said yes, but also that actually does kind of make some sense for Oakland. So that's probably where you get the Leonardo DiCaprio one. And I'm missing one of them. What's the other one?
The other one, I believe, is the dog and the house on fire.
Oh, yeah, this is fine. Yeah. Probably the tight end one then. Would I switch it? No. Yeah, that's probably the tight end one because, that's not no, I can't believe you did it. And some people even want it. But I think a lot of people are just feeling like that's such a weird priority to have given kind of where the team's problems are.
Yeah. Next question is from Kenneth Allen, who asks, does the fact that we waited until the last minute to trade whoever is getting traded for cap relief mean that the trade won't really be in our favor? It seems like teams could take advantage of the situation rather easily.
I think it's actually putting more pressure on those teams because it's waiting for a team to find the cornerback value in the draft kind of bottom out. So once Byron Murphy and Greedy Williams are gone, there's a lot of teams that don't have first round grades on, these other cornerbacks, your Sean Buntings and your David Longs and your whatever. These are all guys that you kind of expect to go in the third and fourth or fifth round. So I actually think it puts more pressure on the teams that want a cornerback that may not be able to get one. So I think that the Vikings are actually attempting to generate leverage by putting them on the actual clock versus the Vikings, who actually don't have to worry about this cap situation again until August, when it's very likely that those draft picks sign. And if they really need to deal with that, they, might extend Kyle Rudolph or something.
So do sports journalists, especially you analytics nerds, have draft parties where you can see who can be the first to recall the spider graphs of each late round pick? Or do you just watch from home?
Well, I've never been to a draft party. So that sounds sad and lonely, but it's because very early on, the Vikings granted me the privilege when I was working with the Daily Norseman to go to the draft media availability they had itself. Yeah, I didn't have to worry about going to draft parties. So yeah, actually, I don't know what analytics nerds do at draft parties. I assume that that's pretty close to correct, though. They try to remember the mock draftable webs and all that, spat off some numbers. It's kind of like, how Mayock plays the game. Oh, we won't get to see that this year. Crap. Mayock plays the game versus the truck.
Yep.
Where he names a prospect and they try to pull up highlights on that prospect, which is actually like shockingly like kind of engaging. If you sold that to me on paper, I would have been like, that's boring. Don't do that. It's way better than like a monkey doing the draft pick or whatever. The third day like sucks for draft antics, but I do like that. It's like I imagine analytics nerds try to do that for like stats that these players have produced. Like, Joe Don Duncan that's a real name, by the way. Joe Don Duncan had like a 37% market share. And someone else would be like, check it. And then the third person will be like, it checks out. And then, everyone cheers and stuff like that. Or like there's a lot of shame if you get the number wrong.
Is there a corner of shame? I want there to be like some form of a corner of shame or like analytics jail.
Yeah, I don't know what that would look like. Well, I mean, probably just actually instead of a dunce cap, just make them wear like a bucket hat or a cap backwards like a frat bro.
Or force them to watch the ESPN coverage instead of the NFL Network one.
Oh, yeah. Really good stuff, I think. Things that just make nerds feel bad.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you'd never been invited to a draft party because you don't like people.
Well, I would imagine that would explain the first couple of years of me doing this, but now I've got a ready-built excuse.
There you go. Luke Braun also asks, a nuclear apocalypse wipes out all of society, except, what luck, the current Vikings roster, creating a Lord of the Flies situation. Who is the leader? Who gets eaten? Who kills whom? What is the nature of society now? Also, because Arif asked for clarification on the caffeine situation, it is stated that he can probably find the beans, but would have to work fairly hard to do so and have to prepare the coffee from scratch. I like how Luke Braun apparently has spent more time in the like young adult dystopia section of the library than you have recently. But I'm not going overall.
Yeah, I probably could go toe-to-toe in the overall one. Probably actually crush him overall. Much to my chagrin. It's a bad genre full of bad books. Don't do it, guys. Yeah, no, I'll take that. I'll take that coffee situation. You have to work for it, and that's how you know that's when the coffee tastes really good. Dusty would disagree because he would talk about how the coffee has to taste good, but I disagree with his imaginary disagreement because taste is just an experience that you can modify based on your surroundings and context.
Crunchy or not.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, it's like, okay, so yeah, have you ever had a drink of milk and you thought it was water and you drank it and you were like, what the hell is this? I'm really upset. Well, you have. I mean, you put water in the cereal. But most people, I didn't even plan that.
No, that happened organically. Thank you for that. I'll be going to the burn ward after this.
But like, your context for how you taste the food changes how the food tastes. That's just how humans work. And that coffee would taste amazing. So great. I'm on board. Now to the actual question about kind of what society would look like, who eats who's the leader that emerges.
Who kills a man with a conch shell.
Right. Yeah. Just normal. Who's screaming Asmar at me, I guess. It's like, who's the biggest nerd? It's me.
I like the idea that you didn't actually survive this whole like apocalyptic scenario, but you did have to ask a question about the caffeine.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think that's the best. It's like it's the Vikings players and maybe coaching staff that survive. Well, it's more interesting if the coaching staff doesn't survive because you can just answer Zimmer takes care of it, which I absolutely trust him to. Yes. But yeah, but it's important. So who ends up leading is the interesting question. Are they going to end up being, a team that has a bunch of leaders that build by consensus and rule by, kind of a deliberative democracy? Or do they just decide that might makes right? My understanding of the culture of the team is that a couple of leaders emerge that engage in deliberative democracy and general rulemaking. I would include Adam Thielen on that leadership council that naturally I wouldn't pick him. I think he would just naturally emerge as one. I would say maybe Harrison Smith. I could see Stephen Weatherly doing it. Might be a little bit arrogant about it, which is fine. I like him. Also, in like the comments of this or in the replies to this tweet, there's like a bunch of funny jokes that there's a good Stephen Weatherly one, so check that out. But yeah, I would imagine that all happens. Who obviously Linval would eat somebody. Who would Linval eat? Kirk Cousins. Very simple.
Seems likely.
Yeah. Someone mentioned Treadwell trying to run away and not being able to do it before Linval caught him. I don't think so. Treadwell's like a team guy. He's just like not like great at football. But that's like a totally different set of things. So I think the team mostly sticks together. At strike, I'm trying to think of who would like go out on their own and just say screw you to everybody. Certainly not Anthony Barr.
Anthony Barr would start and then would come back because he started to make the realization that this wasn't where his heart was.
Yeah. So, big team guy. A lot of people will cry about him coming back.
Everson Griffin would be an interesting wild card.
Yeah, I try to avoid bringing him up in this situation.
It's not a dig at mental health. Just the dude is massive. I'm just... Oh, this is the episode that causes us to fall off a cliff, isn't it?
Oh.
The pre-draft episode. What the hell was I thinking?
You moron.
Let's do a couple more questions before we're done here.
Sure.
Scott Brackett asks, worst case scenario. Top 3 linemen are off the board by pick 18. What is the strategy moving forward to ensure the Vikings come away with a strong draft? Assuming Oliver and Wilkins are gone, do we grab Bradbury or Lindstrom to keep going?
Personally, I grab Lindstrom just because I think that though Bradbury's a better player than Elflein, you end up with a better 2-player guard center combination with Lindstrom playing guard and Elflein playing center versus Elflein playing guard and Bradbury playing center. I think that's probably the direction you go in if you don't like, say, Rashawn Gary or Jerry Tillery, which I think the scenario kind of assumes. That's probably who I'd go with. Again, I also assume this, Jonah Williams is off the board and Andre Dillard's off the board and all that. So that's probably the direction I would go in. And then this kind of tails into that first question about, would you trade up to grab a falling defensive tackle? And in this case, I'd say yes. So if you couldn't do that and nobody falls in the second round, then you've got a bunch of interesting choices to make. I wouldn't be against, a wide receiver. Deebo Samuel will be interesting. He's got a pretty poor analytical profile, but he's been a pretty exciting player when he's been healthy, and so the analytical profile may not kind of say everything you need to about him. Maybe you get Andy Isabella to get kind of that speed guy. I don't know. But I think that in a scenario where, hey, those linemen are gone, you reach maybe just a little bit for one of those interior offensive linemen. Hey, you're not going to be able to trade up for a defensive tackle, or they're just not available at 50. What do you do? And I think you go third wide receiver, unless maybe you're really into Irv Smith. He's just kind of right outside what the Vikings look for at tight end in terms of athletic thresholds, but by just a hair in a couple of directions. So it'd be kind of interesting to see if they kind of break that for somebody who looks as good catching the ball as he does. But yeah, I think my primary move in that case is to try and grab. And this assumes that you haven't traded Trey Waynes and you don't have an extra second round pick and all that. Try to grab a third wide receiver, and there's a couple of options. Plus, I'm talking about guys that are probably second round grades. I totally forgot about the guys that are first round grades are probably going to fall because of how deep this receiver class is. You could end up with a Marquise Brown. You have to wait for him to get healthy again, but he's crazy fast. He's good. You could get AJ Brown, who I like him the most out of all these receivers in the draft. Very few people have ranked him as the top receiver, but he might be the best route runner. And he's very similar to Diggs and Thielen, and so you don't get kind of that complementary aspect. But at some point, better receivers are just better receivers. So you could get him, N'Keal Harry, who's kind of a big slot kind of guy. Those are all options that would be really fun to have as a third wide receiver.
All right, next question is also from Scott, who says, Any issues moving Barr to edge to replace Griffin and add in a new linebacker or promote Eric Wilson? Or is it easier to help find edge help over what Barr does over at linebacker?
Yeah, I think that second part kind of nails it. But also we don't have very much evidence that Barr is very good at rushing off the edge in the NFL. Obviously, he did a very good job of that at UCLA. But the couple of times he's done it with the Vikings, it hasn't been very impressive. Now, if he ends up getting, full-time reps and works with Andre Patterson, that could change, but that's more of a projection. Whereas, trying to find somebody with Barr's skill set is just so difficult. We've talked about it ad nauseum on the show. I don't need to go on a ton, but, his ability to rush from up the middle changes pass protection schemes and forces a bunch of one-on-one pass rushing situations that help enable people like Danielle Hunter and last year Sheldon Richardson and all them get one-on-one blocks that create more pressure. Plus, he's got a bunch of range to shut down the most common response to that, which is to throw short. He's got great sideline-to-sideline range, and that stops that. So that's very difficult to find. And I don't think that you've got a great opportunity edge. On the other hand, the Vikings do a very, very good job of finding edge rushers and making them good. And there's a bunch of athletes in this class at the edge position that you can find in the middle to late rounds. People like Ben Benogu, who I've mentioned a couple of times, just looks and feels like a Viking. He tested a lot like Vikings defensive ends have historically. He's a guy that, I'd keep an eye on as somebody who's a potential Viking. But Max Crosby kind of fits the mold. I just talked about him in a piece that I published today about kind of who the best analytical prospects in the draft are versus kind of where they are on the draft board. He's a guy that's worth watching. Maybe John Kaminsky, who, he's super, super raw and he's kind of big. So you kind of want him to lose a little bit of weight, and then you've got a lot of technical work to do. But his athleticism is kind of through the roof for a player of his size. A lot of athletes this year at the edge position. Not a lot of great edge rushers that you'd want to pick in the second or third round. But a lot of edge rushers that have a lot of athletic potential. I would. That's probably the direction I would go in, is instead try to find another edge rusher.
Yeah. Kyle Slaby asks, I remember an old running joke was that Rick only picks players from one or two conferences in a given draft. Example, 2017 was all ACC and Big Ten. 2014 was ACC and Pac-12. If you could pick one conference that the Vikings could only draft from this year, which one would it be?
I thought about the Pac-12 because of Dillard and some of the UCLA guys that I like. But I don't think there's just enough there in terms of the Vikings need profile. I thought about the Big Ten because kind of like, the wide receiver situation at Ohio State, but there's just like not enough going on, and you end up like drafting Ryan Bates and Michael Jordan, which are like okay but not great. Big 12, you get that really great set of receivers, plus you get Drew Samia, Ben Powers. Maybe you're locked into Cody Ford, and that would kind of suck. But I think honestly it's the SEC, and I'm not a guy that's just like SEC. They produce the best prospects. It's the ACC has been doing pretty well in terms of like winning national championships and producing prospects too. So I don't think that's really it. I think it's really just kind of about where the SEC is strong and where the Vikings need players. So you can grab Irv Smith at tight end. You can there's a whole host of offensive linemen, players like Eric McCoy, Nelton Jenkins, and then obviously Jonah Williams. You could get Lamont Gaillard from Georgia. Late in the draft, you can get Ross Pierschbacher from Alabama. You might be able to get we tried this last week, and we had a Dane tell us that the pronunciation was probably wrong. Hilta, which I didn't get any correction on the first name, so it sounds like I nailed that part. And then Frohelt, not Froholt, but Frohelt, maybe.
Sure.
Yeah, why not? But he's the guy that went to IMG Academy from Denmark. Fell in love with football, went to the United States, went to IMG Academy, and then decided to go to Arkansas because Brett Bielema is known for turning out offensive linemen. Fortunately, Bielema left. Either way, you get access to him, and there's a bunch of good receivers in Ole Miss that you could end up drafting. So a lot of players from the SEC that kind of fit what the Vikings need profile looks like.
Also, from Kyle Slaby, which ice cold beer should I be enjoying during the draft to numb the pain of another day 3 kicker? You live in Wisconsin, dude. Anything from New Glarus is going to be okay.
Yeah, and I guess they do 24-hour or 24-can boxes now.
That just sounds convenient as hell. Finally, from Cal Slaby, with the recent schedule release, have discussions begun on the next destination for the Norse Code on location episode? Yeah, I think it's safe to say that. Is everything good on your end?
Yeah,
everything's good on mine. We will be going to Seattle, as Seattle Twitter has embraced Arif so close, so hard that we have to go to Seattle this year.
There's so many reasons to go to Seattle that have nothing to do with the Seahawks thing, but fine.
There are so many good reasons and so many good Seattle bloggers that have convinced us that we need to go out to the Seattle game. So we will be going to the Monday night game after the bye. We will be in Seattle, and it should be interesting. We're still looking at venues for the Thursday night taping. We're looking at potentially doing something on Monday as well, perhaps before the game. So there's possibilities there, but we'll know a little bit more as the summer and the season begins. But we will be going to the Seattle game. I did see that Eric and Ted will be going to the Kansas City game, which I did have the thought at one point. I was like, wow, there's like everyone in the universe seems to be going to the Kansas City game this year.
There's a non-zero chance that zone coverage might head down to Kansas City, and I'll just probably bum a ride with them. So party in Kansas City as well. I'll be traveling a lot this year, it looks like.
It should be interesting if nothing else. So, but the current plan is to go to Seattle. So when we have more details, we will certainly arrange it. There is a healthy Viking fan group that is in the Seattle area, thanks to all of the people from North Dakota who ended up getting jobs with Amazon and then had their jobs absorbed out to Seattle. So there is a very healthy contingent. That and the Seahawks just seem to pick up Vikings players all the time. Or now they just seem to be picking up all sorts of Kansas City Chiefs picks. I still don't understand what the hell the Chiefs are doing. Like, throughout this episode, I've been looking on Twitter and like everyone's reaction
so
seems to be what the hell.
there's a bunch of Chiefs fans that have like responded to my snarky tweets with like, well, really, they just, moved up a couple of picks from 29, and it's just like gave up like a future set. Like, it's not the idea that because you got some compensation for the D Ford trade doesn't make it good that you spent that compensation on the Frank. Like, I mean, like that's not a great way to think about things because they happen separate from each other, and you can stop the decision making halfway through and get and just get the compensation from D Ford. So yeah, there's just a lot, man. People are like, Frank Clark fits a 4-3 and D Ford doesn't, and it's like that's fake. That doesn't matter anymore. Everything's nickel. Everybody's a stand-up rusher in 2-2-4 nickel or whatever, right? Like it doesn't matter. And some NFL analyst says he fits the 4-3, and then they send me that tweet and they do the frog sipping tea gif. It's so dumb, man.
Some people's kids. That is going to be it for this episode. Arif, let's talk about the big board and pimp your work again.
Yeah. Okay. So I talked about the big board. I've got a consensus of 45 plus rankings to produce a top 300 ranking that has historically done well in performing in the draft. In addition to that, I've also identified 6 Viking sleepers plus 12 other names that kind of fit the same mold that the Vikings could pick late in the draft or find an undrafted free agency. That's up at The Athletic. I did a Vikings mailbag over at The Athletic. And then finally, I also produced a top 100 board that takes the consensus board and modifies it for some of the most recent advances we've made in player evaluation in terms of data. And so there's a top 100 analytical board as well on The Athletic. That's a separate article. I've produced 4 articles the past couple of days. It's a bunch, but just head over there. If any one of those sound good to you, and hopefully if you're listening to this, at least 1 or 2 should. I don't know why you'd be listening to this, but
why is that a thing?
Yeah, head over to The Athletic. This also would be a really good time to plug. Subscribe to The Athletic if you haven't already. because if you click on one of my articles, so I get credit, and then sign up that way, and then use the promo code NFL Draft 40, all one word, all lowercase, you get 40% off. So this is a really good time to do that too.
Well, how about that? Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Again, thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will talk to you guys after the draft. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.